Hey, everybody. I am here with someone many of you, if you have followed me over the years, probably know, Dr. John Hawks. John, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm John Hawks. I'm a paleoanthropologist. I study human origins, and I do it with fossil evidence, the genetic record, genetics of living people, and archaeology. I am a paleoanthropologist in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and also a visiting professor at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa.
Hey, so you're in Wisconsin right now, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I mean, with COVID, as we're recording, COVID is still going on. So it's going to be a little while before you go to South Africa, especially in light of their current pandemic, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're really restricted on what we can do in the field. In South Africa, our team is working in the field. Active excavations are happening. They're running under COVID protocols and have a really great setup for our team down there. But I'm not able to get there, and it's not clear yet when travel is going to resume, and we're going to be able to do actually field work from U.S. institutions.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to a friend of mine, and he does, stuff with museum samples, and this year has been like basically a total waste for him because he cannot travel and he needs to, bring samples here and there, and it's just the shutdown of traveling. So, a lot of the people that I talk to are computational geneticists, computational biologists, and they're okay just sitting in their lab. It's like, okay, so it's going to go on the cluster and all this stuff. But then there's still scientists that need to go out there in the world, and the pandemic's really caused some issues, right?
It's a really tough time, especially for young people, for students, for folks who are early in their careers, who may not have big data sets sitting around that they need to be working on anyway. And I'm fortunate. I've got some amazing data that we need to get out and that we've been working on for a while now. And I've also got some cool work in genetics that I'm working on. So it's great that I'm able to continue with research. But for folks who are students, for folks who are relying on that field experience to really progress in their careers, it is a tough time to be in North America in our line of work.
Yeah, yeah. Although, like, yeah, did you see that ancient direwolf? I haven't read the paper. Did you see that paper today?
Yeah, yeah, it's really cool actually. I mean, you think of wild dogs being the out group of all the canids, and no, actually now it's dire wolves, and they've got all these features that are convergent with actual wolves, and there's this cool part about introgression between the common ancestors of the wolf, jackal, coyote branch and the dire wolves. It's this typical kind of genetic story that we keep finding now is that the world in the past was stranger and mixier than anybody thought.
Yeah, yeah. And so, let's start from a little bit on the beginning in terms of the past. So you came on my radar, um, in uh, in the middle 2000s. You came out with this blog, and I remember, you still got the blog, but you were pretty prolific back then, writing these extended notes, basically, and comments on papers and paleoanthropology, and kind of made you famous, right? Like, you went to a conference and Don Johansson, I think, introduced himself to you and knew you by name and stuff like that. So I guess, like, you were originally an English major, I know that, and then you switched into at University of Michigan under Milford Wolpoff into a paleo guy, a bones guy. Can you tell me, like, how that happened, and then let's transition to just talking about, like, how you decided to start the blog and how that impacted your career.
There's lots and lots of factors that go into anything, and you can always lead off with the most profound thing. And to me today, the most profound thing is people talk about eliminating the GRE and what difference it makes for people to have to take the GRE or not. When I was a senior in college and thinking, I've got this English degree and thinking about going to graduate school, and I've got this anthropology degree, and I've been teaching, labs in anthropology. I increasingly was attracted to it. There was a really clear decision point where you apply to graduate school. And by God, anthropology did not require a special GRE, and English did. And so you, you things like that matter to people in
I
ways that
see.
you can't predict.
Wait, what do you mean? Wait, what do you mean a special GRE? Like you had to take the English subject test?
Yeah,
I know
yeah.
physics, they definitely prefer that. In biology, they don't care.
Yeah. And to be honest, as a student, you don't appreciate that actually most of these graduate programs don't care about this stuff, and they're not looking for that anyway. But if you're coming from an institution like I was, a big state school, but not one with huge graduate programs, and I certainly wasn't talking to folks, who were, trying to sell their undergrad majors on the graduate student market in different places. It's like you learn what you learn. And this, of course, is before the web. I I give myself a little bit of credit that today you could find a lot of this information on websites that no one knew then. It was all word of mouth type stuff.
Yeah,
But
I mean, there's still a lot of word of mouth, I have to say, for the listeners out there thinking of going to graduate school or, having some experience. I think like they will reiterate that there's stuff you can find on, and you're in academia. There's stuff you can find on academic websites that the administration put up, and then like once you get to the graduate program, it's totally different in a lot of sub rosa implicit ways.
yeah, yeah. But I've got to say, as an undergraduate, I really jumped off as an English major. I had a great English instructor in high school that really inspired me in that direction. I, was a comparative lit type guy, and I really loved it. And that actually was is what got me into taking anthropology courses, because the cultural aspect of it, and thinking about the way that cultures matter to works of literature was what I was drawn to. I took a bones course. I was always sort of interested, but the fact is that I grew up in this small town where science was not a thing that people grew up to do, and so I wasn't thinking that direction, even though I was interested in it. But I took a course. My instructor invited students who did well in the course, to teach labs for him as TAs, and I did that and got real teaching experience in it. And that really made me realize that in English, you know, I'm never going to have really a very original thought. And in anthropology, there was tremendous potential for finding out things that no one had ever known before. And that really drew me. So I, got into it, and that was really what made my decision. But it's amazing how things, sort of came together at the right time.
Yeah, yeah, and there's a lot of there's a lot of happenstance. I think a lot of serendipity, in these sorts of things, and yeah, you're not the only one. And so you go and you study anthropology, and so can you talk about what four field anthropology is, and like how you fit into that?
Sure. So in the North American tradition, which is not everywhere, North America has a very particular kind of history of anthropology and how the field developed. Um, it developed, you know, basically out of cultural geography. That's what Franz Boas had as his background. The idea was that if you want to understand humans as beings, we have a biological aspect, right? Our physical makeup matters to us. In the old school days, they called this physical anthropology. Um, but our interactions with each other, our cultures matter to this. Cultures differ in language, so language matters to this. If you look at the time dimension, the history of past populations, archaeology is your avenue to access that in most cultures, because most cultures historically, prehistorically, have not been literate. And so you have this sort of dimension of humanity that divides into these four subfields. Now, there's a lot of academic politics as to why that came about, and the fact is that anthropology as a discipline did not organize itself in this way in Europe. And the way that it happened in the UK and France was different from Germany, but none of them had this kind of four field um, situation. But as it came together in the teens and 20s in the US, the way that state universities and universities across North America were growing, you sort of had this idea that, well, we're going to start these integrative departments. It's like the original integrative transdisciplinary thing. And that today maintains a reality. As I was trained at Michigan, it was a four-field department. I took courses in every kind of anthropology, and I used those in my work, and I still do. So, to me, it's a good grounding. It's good rooting for what I do.
Yeah. And you know, I don't know if we want to get into this. I mean, there's been a lot of debates about anthropology and how these different fields relate to each other. I mean, in particular, cultural and biological. Stanford had a split and then they fused back together. I mean, where are we with that? Are people kind of at some sort of equipoise or equilibrium?
It sort of is. It's the typical academic um, politics versus resources sort of problem. Our resources come ultimately from research funding that we get, which in social sciences is small compared to biological sciences, certainly, um, and and from the students that enroll in our courses. And I teach 600 students a semester when I teach my big undergraduate course. It is a major draw for kids who are, looking to add that biology component. They get breadth credit for taking this, but it's a way of doing it that isn't super molecular photosynthesis. You're learning all this, these very obscure things. We do human biology. We learn about stuff that's relevant to medicine and genetics and stuff. So so when you're talking about what supports departments and why do departments exist and how do they continue to sustain themselves and who gets to hire whom, it's about that kind of stuff, right? Where are the resources? Where are they coming from? And ultimately, in most productive places, we get along with each other and we're interested in what other people in our department do, even if we're not writing papers together. And I think that's the major influence on it in the US. So you have places where you have real jerks who can't get along with each other and they're like, well, I'm going to march off on my own because I'll be better off. And that usually doesn't work. Once in a while it does, right? Once in a while it's like, actually the kind of work that we do is different. We're not being strongly supported by our enrollments. We depend on grants in a big way, and we're going to go into this direction. That's sort of what Harvard did. And you can have a sustainable department if you have that kind of intellectual sort of reality to it.
Yeah, are you talking about like human evolutionary biology at Harvard?
Yeah, human evolutionary biology.
Yeah, and yeah, that's a whole different thing. I mean, like I was talking to a friend of mine about that program. It's very, very idiosyncratic, I guess. I mean, that's a neutral way that I would say it. I mean, it's a fascinating topic, but it's like, was it is it Lieberman? Who was it who started it?
Yeah,
Was it
Dan
Lieberman?
Lieberman was involved in that, and
Yeah.
yeah, and so it's one that's coherent around some human psychology, around primate studies. Richard Wrangham was one of the initiators of that. Um, and when you have people who get along, who can work together, and they see a potential to have, a real graduate training or real grants that are synthetic, you can get things like that. But that's rare in academic life. It's rare in the social sciences, honestly. And so people really draw back on, they rely on their training. Where are we coming from? What do we have to offer that endures, that has some sort of history to it that still continues to matter? And that's the
Mhm.
way I see undergraduate training, which is sort of the way that most departments are framed.
Well, so you go to graduate school, you're doing anthropology. When did you realize you were going to be a paleo guy?
Oh, I went to grad school to be a paleo guy. You know,
Okay.
I went to work with Milford, and I chose Milford. I didn't. I chose to work with Milford because I saw what Milford was doing in the press. That he was engaged. He was involved in these sort of high-profile debate at that time, the out of Africa debate. But he was somebody who was thinking big and able to comment on lots of things. And I thought, this is actually the kind of science I'm interested in. I'm interested in doing things that people can understand, that matter to people, and being able to interact with the public in the science that I do. And that was a really good fit for me. I learned a tremendous amount in graduate school about how science matters to people and the way to become a public scientist. Um, it's a rare kind of environment, I think. It happens sometimes, but it's rare to have the kind of attention that we did in the 90s on this out of Africa multi-regional stuff, the scientific changes that were happening, and to be in a position where we actually were being called on by the press, by media, by everybody to comment on stuff and to really lead the way that people thought about it. And it was a really exciting time.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk so much about this. So this area of human evolution and paleoanthropology, as a young person, and we share a similarity insofar as we come into this kind of from a different field or a different position intellectually, academically. I have original background in biochemistry as an undergraduate, and just my family's, I guess, expectations were that I was going to do something like biochemistry or chemistry, and biochemistry's out of the chemistry degree anyway, but I was always interested in human evolution, and there's always these books that people are writing about these controversies and these topics, and they're fascinating, and there's documentaries on PBS, so I just devoured all that stuff. So I had some general background and knowledge, and listeners who have followed my work and my conversations with people know that I have talked to Chris Stringer, the primary paleoanthropological out of Africa guy, in the 80s and into the present, and Milford Wolpoff, who was more the, his kind of antagonist, maybe, the rival, the multi-regional guy who is, your mentor, your PhD advisor, for my previous podcast, The Insight, and I'll post the links in the show notes for listeners who want to hear them. I feel like everyone's kind of converged together and we can get into that. But there's this whole history, there's this whole rivalry that you kind of dropped into. And I know Michigan, and I've talked to graduate students who reached out to me at Michigan, is kind of because Milford's there, Milford Wolfoff is there. I mean, I think he's emeritus now, but in any case, kind of resistance to the whole out of Africa. Uh, Now meme is trivializing it, but the whole out of Africa orthodoxy that was, you know, reigning supreme for basically 20 years for various reasons, and we'll talk about why it doesn't reign supreme and updates on it. But so you get there to Michigan, you're a graduate student, and I have read some of your work during that period in the late 90s, some of your papers in the year 2000. Can you talk about what you wrote? And you were already interested in genetics back then as a paleo guy, as a bones guy.
Oh yeah. I felt always that genetics was going to be, the center part of this. That if you were trying to understand the fossil record, you had to understand the genetic potentialities of fossils, right? What are fossils actually telling you about populations as deans, as entities that had an evolutionary reality? And ultimately that always came down to genetics, right? When I was doing exclusively fossil stuff as an early graduate student and trying to understand skeletons, I was reading Sewell Wright because understanding why things look similar after thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years, understanding how later populations could come to look similar to each other in different places, right? What is the gene flow like that could enable that? That required a kind of population genetics knowledge that I think probably most people don't appreciate. And it's a corner, it was at that time, a corner of paleoanthropology. There's lots of people who work on functional anatomy, and the main issues are what, what are the mechanical forces on this bone? And how does bone tissue respond to mechanical force? And, how do things work? I was never interested in that. I was interested in how similarities in bone matter in an evolutionary sense, and how do they develop, and what's the potentiality, the cultural potentiality of shifting them in a couple of generations versus the genetic potentiality. So that was where I started. Now, obviously, this is the time that the sort of mid late 90s when the Human Genome Project was happening, and that meant that the evidence that was relevant to me, to us, to understand human origins was suddenly starting to be dominated by gene sequencing from living populations of humans, and where the common ancestors of particular genes were in the world and how long ago those ancestors lived. And so that really transitioned me into really pop gen, all the stuff that I ultimately worked with Henry Harpending and Alan Rogers on what is how long what are genealogies like in populations, what can you learn from gene genealogies, and how do you put those together into a picture of of evolution.
Yeah, I mean, I think we take it for granted this synthesis between paleoanthropology, paleontology, and population genetics, the study of these gene frequencies now. But man, back in the 80s and 90s, that there was some thin gruel there. There wasn't that much data. The pop gen people were still focused on these two locus theoretical models because there wasn't that much data, and the data that you had was mostly from Drosophila and a few other natural examples. Human population genetics was really, really thin. But did you anticipate while you were working with Milford what was going to happen?
I think that, looking back on it now, I think that I thought about it in these terms then, but I might not have explained it very clearly then what was going on. Two things became clear. One, there were not very many geneticists who knew anything about, the big picture of human evolution. And so there was a niche to do genetic work that was actually speaking to evolution, human evolution, in a way that most people weren't doing. So I thought, okay, there's a niche here that you can get into where the data are available, right? This is a moment in history when suddenly, if you wanted to work on genetics, you didn't need to take people's blood and do it in a wet lab anymore, right? We had now the internet, and you had gene sequences on GenBank, and you could actually do stuff with work, secondary uses of data that other people were gathering at increasingly fast scales, um, in a way that no one could keep up with. And so that was a big part of it. But the other big part was, as a student of Milford's, I was, at the forefront of thinking theoretically, but Milford is not a field guy. I was not going to be going out and digging fossils, doing the kind of work that I was doing. And that was a problem because it's very hard to do original work on fossils in those days without going to dig them out of the ground yourself. And even if you did, there weren't very many of them. You had folks like Tim White, who was really the world leader in finding fossil hominids, saying, this is drying up. We're not going to have a lot of new fossil finds. And the folks that I knew who were going into that area were always struggling to be able to work on things and lead projects on them because there's this long apprenticeship of carrying the water for people that you did before you actually got to do anything original and new yourself. And so, I looked at that as a young person and I thought, one of these areas has got a career, and the other of these areas is going to be really painful and really hard to make progress. And so that made my decision easy. I was going to work more and more on genetics.
Yeah, so okay. You come out of this multi-regionalist tradition, which was very much a minority. Actually we kind of have like discussions about this online because some of our mutual friends and acquaintances in academia claim that out of Africa wasn't so dominant. And I mean, I don't know. I feel like the term gaslighting is overused, but I remember the early 2000s, and I thought I was pretty plugged in for a layperson, and it was very dominant, right?
The thing is that if you looked at this as a dichotomy, right, there's two ways of looking at things, and you're doing work that supports one way or work that supports the other way. The out of Africa was very productive, and it was very good at the folks who were pursuing that line of inquiry, in anthropology, right? I'm not talking about genetics. In anthropology, the folks pursuing that line of inquiry were the ones that were getting these big grants and really, building collaborative research projects of the kind that today, it wasn't the case at the time, but today this stuff is all the ERC, right? You have these mega grants that support, a lot of work and a lot of careers, and that was happening with out of Africa in anthropology, archaeology during the 90s, early 2000s. um, the So I would say that when you look at what's happening, right, what's being published, there's a lot more of it being published. And that didn't necessarily mean that the intellectual sort of, if you took a poll of paleoanthropologists, I think the poll would be sort of even. But the fact is that where work was happening was much more happening in that out of Africa perspective. Um, in genetics, I think that much more this was an out of Africa centric world, right? I used to go to conferences in this era and talk about, okay, here's how you interpret these data from a viewpoint that is not an out of Africa centric viewpoint, right? Here's how these data are consistent with multi-regional evolution. And I'd have folks sniggering at me in the audience, like, who is this idiot? you know and and so I can tell you that it certainly felt in genetics like this is a very minority viewpoint.
Yeah. I mean, I know there. I mean, I read some papers in the mid 2000s, by pretty prestigious people like Laurent Escoffier about how it's just looking at the genetic data, it's impossible for there to have been Neanderthal admixture.
Oh
You know,
yeah,
and,
yeah, that
and
was
so
absolutely, yeah, a very mainstream view. um,
yeah,
yeah.
and so you come into this in the mid 2000s. At this point, you're in Henry. You just got done with a postdoc in Henry Harpending's lab at Utah, and you are at Wisconsin, right?
Yeah, that's right.
An assistant professor, and you start writing this blog, and you're writing all sorts of things about introgression, which basically, like, the gene flow of alleles from one population into another, Neanderthal introgression. And you were working with Henry and Greg Cochran at the time about this issue, and talking about baboons and hybrid zones and stuff like this. What was the reaction from your colleagues about this?
I think that yeah, I know and interact with so many people in different fields, and it's hard to generalize, right? I think if you talk about what are my colleagues in anthropology saying, they're saying, wow, this is interesting and fascinating, and aren't you doing, so you're doing some cool work, and we would love to see you publish more research. And let me tell you, I was publishing a lot of research. I did all right, especially for an anthropologist. I had, was certainly publishing enough. But whenever, as an academic, you're doing things that people did not have an easy way to conceive of what is the value of this on your CV, you do start to get those questions of what are you doing here, and it was not uncommon in those days. I mean, you remember these days well. That in about 2004, 5, 6, folks who were doing blogs were not getting tenure at places, and
Are you talking
you
about, like, Dan Dresner, Sean
yeah,
Carroll, 2
Dresner,
prominent
Sean
ones?
Carroll, these are top people, right? This isn't like, there are some folks who didn't get tenure at places that maybe, maybe they should have spent more time writing research than blogging, but you had people who were highly successful, in the public outreach area and in their research, and this was having a negative career impact on folks, and I was watchful for that. But the fact is that, you know the way that I ran around about blogging and writing, and the integration of what I was doing with the kind of research I was interested in, always made that a better fit for me than I think it might have been for a lot of people.
Well, so, I mean, what was the reaction to all this stuff about, adaptive integration and gene flow between archaics and all this stuff? I mean, I know, we live in a different world now after ancient DNA from Neanderthals, but let's talk about 2005 to 2010.
I'll give you two extreme reactions. Reaction number one, which is sort of my favorite, came from Francesco Ayala. Now, Ayala is a big time figure in human genetics. Has, I suppose he still is a member of the National Academy, but is in some disrepute, you know, in the last few years because of some problems with his interactions with female colleagues. But Ayala, I was with him at a meeting in this era, and I was talking about the history of studying introgression. And the thing is that introgression was coined by folks who were working on plant genetics, Um, and Stebbins had been really important to this, Ledyard Stebbins. And Stebbins had actually been Ayala's colleague and mentor for some time. And so I was talking about introgression. I said, it's ironic that today we look at people like Stebbins and think we're writing about plants in a way that has real application today, in a way that wasn't appreciated, because actually Ernst Mayr, who became the leader of understanding speciation in animals, um, really believed that introgression, hybridization were not important to the evolutionary process. He thought these are weird things, doesn't work in animals. Maybe it works in plants, but in animals is not important. And I said, isn't this ironic that actually what we look at genetics today, we're finding that actually these processes that people were writing about in the 40s from the plant biology point of view are actually really important. And Ayala said to me, this is ridiculous, and Stebbins would not agree with you. So that was to me a moment of, look, I I'm reading this classic literature. It makes perfect sense to me, and I can't talk to the guy. But here's Ayala saying, you're ludicrous to think that hybridization is important in any way in understanding human evolution. Um, so that was one extreme. The other extreme came from my friend Alan Mann, who at the time I was writing about introgression wrote to me and said, this is really ridiculous, because what you're talking about is gene flow, right? You don't need a special name for this. This is an ordinary process that we understand is happening all the time in human evolution. And if you give it a name like introgression and imply that it's somehow different or special from ordinary gene flow, what you're saying is that we're weird and we're not working the way that other species work. And so you should be minimizing the terminology. You shouldn't be increasing it. And I'd say that I had a spectrum of viewpoints in between those. Um, to and those viewpoints, the spectrum is actually accurate. People really take away from words varied meanings, and the word introgression, the word hybridization is still one that those are words that I struggle with today, because they really mean to people things about species and interbreeding between long lasting lineages that I don't necessarily mean every time I use them. And
Hmm.
it is a constant struggle to be like, okay, what is the model that we're talking about? And how do we study it in a reductionist way, in a way that we can actually test things about it?
Yeah, I mean, like we're kind of getting a little bit, I don't know about philosophy, but the words like hybridization have like really, really, they have connotations for people. So, for example, like I don't really care about if hominins are different species or the same species. Like, what's in a word? I mean, I know some people really care, but like there's a lot of gene flow. We know that. That's what matters. So I actually avoid the word hybridization because then people seem to get a connotation of difference, and I don't really want to emphasize that, at least genetically. And so, I mean, that's interesting how words matter. One thing that I will say, um, since you were talking about this stuff in the 2000s, we have so many genetic resources, including ancient DNA, where people are always drawing these graphs that show gene flow and hybridization between all these distant lineages. We didn't know all that back then.
it was literally, um, you had the option of zero or some, and that was our ability to test things. My dissertation models were like this. You had, okay, here are these two populations, and are completely isolated, and then here's a continuous isolation by distance model that fit those two to the data is sort of the sort of thing we would do. And you had no ability to test for entities, all of the stuff that's happened with the development of ancient DNA, the 1,000 genomes, so long stretches of phased genomes where you can look at mutations, has been important to this. And big samples, right, is your ability to actually make these bubbles of populations and try to estimate measurements between them. Um, it didn't exist 15 years ago. And we really were focused on these very, today, what we would consider to be extremely basic questions, right? Did Neanderthals contribute any genetics to living people? And and we argued about that for 150 years, right? I don't want to minimize the importance of this question, but the fact is today that's sort of an uninteresting question.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we wouldn't conceive of it as being an interesting question, right? We'd say, oh, of course they interbreed some, but what difference did it make? And what did it affect this and that? And what were the populations of them like? And was some of them interbreeding with us more than others? And we have all these questions now that we couldn't have even imagined then.
Yeah, one thing that I will say is, if the admixture of the ancestry proportion is, on the order of now 2% detectable, like I know that there's probably some selection purifying it was higher initially, but it's a relatively low proportion. It'd just be hard to have the statistical power to detect that without ancient DNA and whole genomes.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was working with bones. Some of my first work, which I presented at a Cold Spring Harbor conference once, was okay. Let's do a rough estimate based on discrete traits of bones. So rare traits that are either present or absent, and there are some that differ between Neanderthals and modern people. So when you find these at reduced levels in later European populations, but not anywhere else in the world today, you sort of have a rationale for thinking, well, maybe the Neanderthals gave these to later people. And if that's the case, what would you estimate as the level of gene flow? And, sort of back of the envelope type, algebra suggested that this is going to be something like 10% or 15%. And that was a level that actually you couldn't reject with anything at that time but mitochondrial DNA. And mitochondrial DNA, you had all these questions about, the way that we looked at mitochondrial DNA then, the Brian Sykes approach of there were 7 original women in Europe in the Upper Pleistocene, right? We now know is ridiculous. And it didn't happen
Helena
that way at all.
represent, Helena represent.
you know so we just, I mean, it's hard for folks today maybe who have started following the field post Neanderthal genetic DNA stuff to really appreciate how stupid our frameworks for looking at things were.
Yeah.
But they really were, um, for valid reasons, right? We had only DNA from today's people. We did not. I was, working on how actually there's so many changes in the Neolithic in Europe. Maybe actually Upper Paleolithic people don't have that much to do with today's Europeans. Well, today we know that that is true vastly more than I thought at the time, and nobody really was thinking, wow, today's Europeans are just going to be different. People were
Yeah.
looking at Cro-Magnons like, okay, well, this is the beginning of the European race. They were not thinking about what the dynamics of those populations were across 40,000 years of time.
Well, I mean, one thing I would say is you can ask the question, but we had no tools to answer them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, you could say the past was complicated. It was more complicated than we appreciated. But you could say those words in 1998. The past was complicated. But that's just sort of like telling stories until you have observations that are rooted in some sort of framework that enables you to say this is different from that. If there was no change, we wouldn't see this. The real quantitative measurement has really only become possible in the last 10 years.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of this is like a lot of our conversation here is technologically driven. Like the abstract scientific questions were always there. So okay, you had all this stuff you'd written. You wrote a couple of papers with Henry and Greg, about admixture and Neanderthals and adaptive introgression, and Bruce Lahn was working in this area. There was just a lot of stuff going on between 2005 and 2010, but you guys were kind of perceived as weirdos, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. we did- we were we did, nothing illustrates that better than the fact that we were working on natural selection. Um, and that sticks out so much more than introgression in terms of the history of science, because today, nobody argues about gene flow from Neanderthals and introgression, whatever. Okay, it happened, and we wonder how important it was, etc. But okay, you measure this selection. Of course, today we talk about selection a lot, and everybody understands that there are some parts of the genome that have been selected in recent populations, etc. When I started writing about selection in 2004, 2005, and was publishing on that, I had human geneticists who said to me, selection never happens. And it is hard, I know, for folks today who are human geneticists to realize that there was a time when you couldn't get work on selection in humans published because reviewers said it was an unimportant aspect of our history. the,
Yeah.
this is, yes, people looked at me and others as if we had horns growing from our heads, and the reality is that human genetics had gone a particular way, and the way that it went, ultimately a huge correction happened, and folks saw the potential of studying these factors that you could study in large genome wide samples like natural selection, like introgression, etc. but but at that time it was highly driven by folks who were working on locus specific questions, on pedigree, ultimately specific questions, and that was where the big stuff was, right? The Francis Collins didn't get to be famous for organizing the hap map. This was, the kind of science that people got into this for, thought was important, thought was central, was science that had to do with the connections between genetics and health and variation in the large scale between populations.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about you becoming, kind of Neanderthal man for a little while. Around 2010, and I did a podcast with you with Spencer Wells on the Inside about Neanderthals about like I don't know, it was like 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago now. You know, so Ed Green now at Santa Cruz, I think, but at the time Max Planck with Fonte Pabo, uh, they got a Neanderthal genome. They looked at it and they checked with David Reich and Nick Patterson, and they were just, wait, what's going on here? It looks like non-Africans have Neanderthal ancestry, right?
Yep.
So a lot of us heard about it a little earlier, and we started kind of like leaking little comments here and there, but people were just clueless what was going on. How did your life change after that got published, which kind of frankly validated a lot of the things you were saying? um, and all of a sudden you weren't the crazy man. Everyone had always thought what you thought. Is that a correct way to
I think that, a little bit, it lended a kind of credibility to understanding those kinds of population interactions that hadn't been there, maybe 5 years earlier. Um, it it was a little bit awkward, right? Because okay, it was great for me because I was in a good position to contextualize this, to put these together with what we understood about Neanderthals, and it was a convenient moment in the history of science for that to happen, because the archaeology of Neanderthals had progressed in a really interesting way during the previous decade toward humanizing them. The more that out of Africa pushed Neanderthals away from us, the more that archaeologists started to feel comfortable trying to understand the human like aspects of their behavior, the modern like aspects of their behavior, I should say, and really humanize them, because there was an appeal in, the pendulum can only swing so far, right? There's only so many grants you could get to say that Neanderthals are stupid idiots and drooling, and therefore we need to understand how they became so awful. And because at a
Yeah.
certain stage it's like, actually, why are you studying those weird things? You've got to figure out what's interesting about them. What was interesting about them was, how are they so much like us if they're not here? And and what that allowed was a convergence of, oh, they're so much like us because they were us in some sense, and let's understand that. And it has been, right, for the past decade. It has been a wonderful time to be thinking about Neanderthals, and thinking about how to understand that population, because in so many ways it's not what we thought it was. right? When you go to Central Asia, go to places like Denisova, where the best Neanderthal DNA is, as well as the Denisovan DNA, and realize, oh my gosh, I'm a long ways from Spain. This is a population that was really different from what historically people had stereotyped.
Yeah.
Um, it's been exciting. It's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many cool things we could talk about. I think question that I would ask you as a paleo person with some knowledge of the skulls and the fossils and everything. So in 2004, Flores hominin shows up. Then we discovered Neanderthal admixture. We discovered Denisovans through the genes, and now there's some fossils that are showing up. There's stuff going on in the Philippines. There's basal lineages in Africa. There's Homo naledi. Okay, bro, how speciose were we a couple of 100,000 years ago? I mean, assuming like, take a liberal idea of what species is. Obviously they're cross fertile and whatnot.
Yeah, if you asked, what kinds of lineages existed 100,000 years ago, um, that had sort of multi-100,000 year duration to them. Let's say they became separated from each other 300,000 years or earlier. So that's as different or more different than it's more different. Let's just say more different than anybody living today is from each other. Let's say everybody living today is one group. Let's talk about how many groups there were 100,000 years ago. And I think honestly, if you ask me to put money in a pool, I think I would put my money on 12. I think that there were 12 kinds of things as different or more different from each other than anybody living today is from each other at that time. And maybe 12 is, maybe I should go higher, but I'd say 12. I think Neanderthals, Denisovans, but probably, if I use that standard, there might be two and maybe more populations of Denisovans, more different from each other than anybody is today from each other.
Yep.
Um, there were Luzonensis, Floresiensis, there were possibly naledi. There were probably two or three others of these in Africa. I think we don't know yet what South Asia looked like. I expect that there's going to be one or two others. Um, it's growing our knowledge of that diversity, and that's a world that if you imagine taking sort of like chimpanzee population structure today, where you have these four deeply divergent subspecies, the most connected of them, I think I'm going to get this wrong because it's off the top of my head, but I think that it's troglodytes and Schweinfurthii are closer than the others are to each other, but their divergence is before 300,000, 400,000 years ago. Um, and you've got bonobos, which are a species, separate place, that diverged prior to a million and maybe as early as 2 million, right? So take that population structure and stretch it across the old world. I think that's what hominids were like. I think we actually had a very ape like population structure, including long lasting subspecies and what we would today call subspecies, probably, and species. And some of them were more like each other than others. Some of them we might feel comfortable calling subspecies, because they sort of look like the same species. They're hard to diagnose relative to each other, but genetically, they're going to turn out to be 300, 400,000 years divergent from each other.
Yeah. Yeah, and so let me back up for the listener here. With the Denisovans, for example, something that I've looked at closely and I've talked to people working in the genetics of that area. I mean, that's not going I'm 90% sure that that's not going to last as a taxonomic category. Like, it might last in the popular literature, in Scientific American and stuff like that because you need a label, but, there's some deep structure, there's some deep divergences within these quote unquote Denisovans from the ones in Siberia all the way to the ones probably in Southeast Asia and into South Asia, right?
Yeah. And if you look at the fossil record of those places, I mean, ultimately, these populations are going to line up with the fossil record in some way. And the fossil record has a duration to it in these places. If you think, wow, there must have been Denisovans in Sundaland, because their unique Denisovan components show up in Sahul, and so you've got these. There must have been a divergent population, and it must have been somewhere. Let's say it was in Java. You know what the fossils in Java look like? They look like the terminus of a long-lasting erectus-like lineage, and, that's 100,000 years ago. So, okay, are the Denisovans this? And if they are, well, wait a minute. How do they end up looking so much like erectuses that are there 800,000, a million years ago? Um, it's ultimately these have to line up somehow, and it could line up that the genetics we're finding is just of populations that the fossil record isn't representing. That could happen.
Yeah.
But if it does happen, then we're multiplying entities yet further.
Yeah, yeah.
And
It's like, the principle of parsimony was so elegant and clean 20 years ago when there was a finite amount of data, you know?
yeah, yeah. Look, you asked me. Yeah, I'm a believer now in the idea that when we find new things, we are likely to find new information. Um, and it was Naledi that made me that, right? I had the experience of having of day by day finding fossils that I could not explain, and that that has changed me forever. I am never going to look at things as if the finding the completely unexpected is not a big part of what I expect. And so I think, I expect more of this. I, Clearly, we're going to have more of it before we start actually converging on things again and again.
All right. So, I mean, I know you guys are still working on Naledi. But can we just talk a little bit about Naledi and what you know now? I mean, we talked to Lee a couple of years ago, and I've talked to you and Lee, like not recorded, just like person to person. There's still work going on in Naledi. Can you just like introduce Naledi? And you and Lee wrote a book together on it. It's a great book. People should. I'll put that in the show notes. But can you talk a little bit about Naledi? What we knew, what we know, what you anticipate?
Sure. Um, I try to be very precise about what I say because we are in the middle of things, and it's not precision for the sake of being like, hey, we have these working ideas and I don't want to share them yet. In fact, I'm quite happy to share working ideas, but people do have a way of taking away working ideas as if they're true. And so I try to be as accurate as I can. We've got Naledi now. We have published fossil evidence from the Dinaledi chamber, which is the super inaccessible one that's really hard for everybody to get to, that I can't reach, and that's got at the moment um, at least, well, I haven't counted in this way, so I'll leave that for a second. We've got the Lassetti chamber, which we've published, which is far. These are both part of the same overall cave system, but they're far from each other. They're separate depositional situations. And we've got at least three individuals of Naledi, including one really nice skeleton there. We have in the past several years done more exploration in the cave system. We have um, fossils from several additional localities. Some of those are near the Dinaledi chamber, in situations that are extraordinarily difficult. I mean, Dinaledi is hard to get into. Some of these fossil situations that we have are places where our most skilled team members can reach in extremis. Um, but we have Naledi material from some of these places. We've got wonderful skeletal material that we've brought out of the cave that we're studying in the laboratory from an area that we call the hill antechamber. Um, we've got, in other words, multiple Naledi situations. So far, we've not found anything that I could attribute to any other species. Looks like this species, which lived by our best guess, our best estimate, I should say, between 230 and 330,000 years ago, this species was using this cave in a very intensive way. They could use the deep parts of the cave, they were familiar with them, they were comfortable with them. Our interpretation of this is that this species was using the cave for its mortuary practices, um, That's an interpretation that we're left with after excluding a lot of alternatives, but that we're continuing to investigate. We want to understand what's going on here. Um, and that's sort of the big picture that we have at the moment. We're continuing to do work in Rising Star. We had folks working in Lassetti this last fall, and we will have again before very long more excavation happening. So lots of stuff going on there.
Well, I mean, what is up with Naledi's small brain?
It's a great question. And it's one that I keep coming back to, right? Because here's an interesting thing. Um, Olorga Siley is a site in Kenya that is really well known for its Acheulean hand axes. It's a gigantic floor that's like paved with hand axes. And hand axes, major, it's a big Acheulean site. And Olorgesailie has produced one hominin fossil, and that fossil is a frontal bone and a little bit more of a skull of what, when it was found in 2004, 2005, they called Homo erectus. But its brain is probably about 620 cc's. So and honestly, this frontal bone looks like a naledi frontal bone. So here's a situation where you have Acheulean small brain hominin. In Rising Star, we do not have artifacts that we can associate with the fossil material of Naledi. They're just not in the same place in a way that we can study archaeologically. We do have artifacts, and we're trying to understand the situation of those artifacts and whether they do come from Naledi. But the question is, what's going on with the small brain? I think the answer to that is that whatever the big brains of modern people and Neanderthals and some of the sort of other large brain archaic human type things are about, they're not about some of the technical spatial stuff that hominins really relied upon. I sort of feel like a habilis like brain gets us most of the way to humanity. And so, what then are we doing with the rest of it? and that, I think, right now is a mystery. It could be that some of this symbolic stuff that we rely on, that language is drawing upon large brains, right? I'm totally willing to believe that we're using our large brains. Um, but I'm also open to the idea that maybe large brains are buffering in ways that we don't expect. That geez, maybe the advantage of a large brain is you live in a place with lots of chronic diseases, and you're gonna have all kinds of problems that you need to buffer with behavioral strategies. Maybe a large brain is about social information that goes across some very large distance, and getting bigger and bigger and bigger is just something that you can afford as you have a more reliable base of high energy foods, etc. Um, it's I look at it, in other words, not as what's going on with the small brain, but what's going on with the big brain.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think I don't really know the answer to that.
Well, I mean, that's what science is. You don't know the answer to a lot of questions, I guess. So we got Naledi, we got the mystery of the Denisova. There's just so many things that have happened in the last 10 years, that I mean, it kind of blows my mind. I mean, in the 15 years that I've known you, I mean, the adventure that we have been on as people interested in human evolution, I don't think I can communicate it in words, right?
It's amazing, and I feel such tremendous, really a place of I appreciate the connections that I've had with people, that the generosity of many of my colleagues, people who have become dear friends and colleagues of mine today that I didn't know 15 years ago. That I have been really fortunate to be in a position where I've been involved in some of these really important discoveries, and have been able to contribute to them, because that's something that I certainly didn't expect would happen in my life. That actually the mainstream, the cool stuff, I've been able to be a part of some really cool stuff. And there's other awesome stuff that I've been able to visit and to see on site and to interact with people who are doing the cool stuff. It's
Mhm.
an incredible moment in the science of human origins, because I don't think there's been one like this before, where so many different kinds of people are coming up with new discoveries that shift or reframe the way we think about things that could not have been made 15 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's for sure. So, let me, you know, I want to ask you about ancient DNA, the industrialization of it, the Reich-Willerslev oligopoly. Like, are you okay with discussing this issue? Because it's something that you've been talking about the last couple of years.
Oh yeah, no, I'm totally comfortable. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, just to give some listeners some context here, um, over the last 10 years, I mean, there's been an exponential, and like, I'm using this in in the technical sense. It's not linear, it's an exponential growth in the amount of ancient DNA remains that we have whole genome sequences or SNP array, like a lot of like genome-wide data. And this is due to improvements in technology in laboratory work and workflow pioneered to a great extent by Svante Pabo in the late 2000s, and he was working in various fields related to ancient DNA for a couple of decades before it really started taking off. And it's become an issue where a couple of laboratories, I mean, have become really proficient at taking these samples, crushing them up, getting maybe like the inner ear bone. There's some various things, enamel like in the inside of the teeth, certain areas that you get these samples from, and then they extract the data and then they publish it. And it just turns out to be kind of a Matthew effect, I think, where the rich get richer, and there's two kind of coalitions. Really, there's some other outside people, but really you work with either David Reich's group at Harvard, or you work with Eske Willerslev, and I think he's between like the Geogenetic Center in Denmark and Cambridge right now. So those are two big groups. There's other groups that have ancient DNA labs, which is it's not rocket science. It's a process. You have to set it up, but it's also due to economics. You have economies of scale. You have all of these lab techs. You have all of these people with skills in these big lab groups, and they've been producing all these publications. Now, there's two issues that I think need to be addressed. And one issue is just the, shall we say, inequity of the Matthew effect within science, where you have to work with these groups. Like if you want to work in this area, you can do it outside of there, but it's like doing off Broadway. Okay, like that's the easiest analogy that I think I would use. So that's like the issue of like sociology of science, where it's just not fair that these two groups, and their coalitions and their partners like Ron Panasi, like there's people out there where it's like they're sourcers, they're providers of samples, and then they get these publications in Science and Nature, just really high impact publications. Okay, the other issue is, okay, they're getting the DNA, they're getting the remains from museums, and they're destroying some of it. That is a big deal for the heritage of humanity. And then the second aspect is, okay, um, what does it mean to get the remains of a human being that died 5,000 years ago? What does it mean if there are descendants of that population in the local area? Um, who has rights to it? Who makes the decision of what gets done? And John, you have written, and I'll link to the paper. I think you've been on some papers, some comments about this, having back and forth with these various lab groups, and you've been pretty vocal along with some of your other, um, you know, colleagues in paleoanthropology about it. So, can you talk about your perspective, where you come down, what your concerns are, etc. With
Sure.
my intro?
Yeah, no, I think you've given a really good introduction. I mean, you've hit on what I think are super important topics. Um, a topic that I would add to that, that I find to be super important, is the topic of scientific colonialism. That we're studying the remains of ancestors of groups of people that have been economically, politically marginalized, many of them indigenous peoples, but not all. Some of them, majority populations in countries where I work, but where they're not, having equitable access to careers in laboratory science or funding for laboratory science. And so there's the question of what does it mean to work on the ancestors of people who don't have the same kind of possibility of working on their own ancestors as you as a scientist at Harvard or Max Planck or anywhere else has. And that to me is also an important part of this. Um, I would say, I've been really blessed to be part of, a working group for the American Society of Human Genetics. That we had a paper that came out last fall about promoting ethical considerations in the study of ancient DNA. I've got some wonderful colleagues from all kinds of parts of the world that are concerned with these issues. Many of them indigenous scientists, some of them African scientists, some of them and some of them here in North America. And so I my role in this, the reason why I got interested in writing about this, in thinking about it deeply, is partly because of my position, as someone who doesn't need to have samples in order to do my work. And so I feel like, as a little bit of an outsider, I don't rely upon access to specimens that are being sampled by labs. And that gives me the possibility of having a voice that many people are afraid to exercise because they're afraid that their access is going to be cut off. And so that's one reason why I'm engaged in this. But another reason is that I've now been on both sides of this. I'm a consumer of data. I use data that ancient DNA labs have generated. I am interested in scientific questions that can only be addressed with those data. But I'm also a producer of fossils. And I am called upon by museum curators, and for the fossils that we are responsible for excavating, I'm called upon to make decisions or to consult on decisions about what will be destroyed and what will be done. And that has really made me think very hard about what the impact of our decisions today will be on future scientists and the ability to recover information with better technology that will exist. So I try to think about it in that long term also. I want to develop science, right? I want science in South Africa where I work to be strong. I want science, to be possible and to be strong everywhere in the world where people are, because I think it's important for people to be scientists. Um, I don't think it's healthy for the world to have science centralized in North America and Europe and Japan and China, right? The sort of primary industrial places where science today is centralized and highly funded. I think it's an unhealthy situation. I think science should be more broadly distributed, and that we should be doing everything that we to bring science to people so that scientists can help them where they are. Um, and help in my field means to help people understand our connections to the past and our connections to each other. I'm some we, People are doing work on Neanderthals and COVID genes now, right? So it's not the case that what we do is irrelevant to human health, but most of the work that I do is not with an eye toward applied human genetics, right? Most of the work that I do is about how we understand our place in the world, how we understand the connections between humans. And I think that that's important. I think it has a valued role in understanding, um, in people getting along with each other in the world. I've certainly seen it that way in South Africa, and I've seen it that way in the United States. So, so I think about those things for those reasons. What is my take on the world right now, the world of ancient DNA? One thing that I keep in the front of my mind always is that the stuff that today is possible and expensive 15 years from now will be cheap. And so there's a kind of sense to which, yeah, okay, people want to build labs today. They want to get funding to do science. They want to have lots of postdocs. They want to generate good scientific questions and scientific research. And I think that that's important, right? It's developing the science. Our science wouldn't be developing right now. It would be a backwater if there weren't people highly invested in building laboratories and building great scientific work on these sort of deep questions that are applied to human ancestry and human origins. So I think that that's tremendous, and I love the fact that it happens. I sort of think that a lot of that could happen with the same amount of funding with sample sizes that are about a fourth of what they are. It's- I feel like there's a little bit of extravagance
Mhm.
that people have exercised in gathering up samples, in saying, you know what, if we can get access to this, we should drill all the bones because we don't know when we're going to have the chance to do that again. And and I sort of feel like a global sort of picture would be, well, let's actually focus particularly on certain kinds of questions that allow us to develop the science and set some questions aside for the time when actually this is going to be possible with much better technology. This is what we do with our decisions about what kinds of things to exercise with bones from fossil situations. And when do we sample this bone or that bone, right? When is the right time? I always think in terms of what's the historically, right? When can this bone help us to develop our science in a way that is not possible for other, maybe more common, less rare remains, um, or is not possible for other research questions. And that you always have to weigh what's going on with the research that you're doing, with the country where you work, with the connections that you are, the people that you're working with. You know, none of this is simple. All of this is tied into the human relationships that make science possible. But I look at things with an eye toward, let's get as much data as we can when we're doing the data collection. Let's invest in. I love some of the work that Ian Matheson is doing with understanding the pathways of selection in past populations,
Mhm.
which is using these ancient DNA samples to look at what are the changes that are happening and what predictions would we make about phenotypes. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we were funding research on the phenotypes, which includes skeletal measurements and CT scans of skeletal remains, this sort of stuff, at the same level as we're funding the genetics? Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
kind of thing where, oh my gosh, we would support so many more scientists, including specialties that exist in some of the countries that don't have giant ancient DNA labs, and that would enable us to tie together these disciplines that do exist separately, so that we know where they work, where they intersect with each other. And when we are working on fossils somewhere that we can't get genetics, maybe we'll develop some confidence that we know what we're looking at. So I think, I always think of it in terms of what's the big picture 15, 20 years from now, right? What is our science going to look like? If I look at that today, I think 20 years from now, I'm going to wish I had much better data sets of phenotypes from these skeletal samples. And I'm going to wish that I had a better knowledge of the variance in outcomes in different samples from the different kinds of molecular data collection that we could do. Um, you know,
Yeah.
I we don't know today whether the petrous bone, right, this inner ear part, is a unique repository of any other kind of evidence besides DNA.
Yeah. Yeah.
That seems like a critical missing element to this picture if we're destroying them left and right.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, those are all fair points, and they're pretty straightforward to me in terms of, they're analytically tractable. Whether you agree or disagree, the grounds of the disagreement are pretty straightforward, and people have to make a judgment, and someone's gonna make the final call on that, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So let's talk about, something which I think is a little bit more difficult. So I saw an interview with Eske Willerslev, recently, and I think it was when he was collaborating with Rasmus Nielsen, in the early teens and working on, ancient Aboriginal, Australian Aboriginal, Indigenous, whole genomes and getting the consent of the local people. And Eske was, I mean, I can find it. I'm gonna find it and I'll link to it because I don't want to be mischaracterizing him. But he basically said if the local people don't want the analysis done, he's not going to do it.
Hmm.
And I don't I understand where he's coming from, but I think if you look at this logically, it doesn't go to a place that is in keeping with the frankly transgressive nature of what science is, in terms of its relationship to mythology. And so, I think a lot of scientists today are saying things like this, and I understand why. The political climate, and they come from a place where they are trying to do good in the world. But my question then is, what is science then? Because when the original human evolutionary biologists, when Descent of Man came out, Darwin was overturning over 1,000 years of European cultural orthodoxy. And yes, there was kind of a moment in the late Victorian era where people were receptive to that, but there were many people who were shocked, and the existence of creationism in the United States, and to a lesser extent elsewhere, is pointing to an anti-modernist trend of outrage due to the fact that they feel like this is a dehumanizing truth, right? And so when scientists hear that, they say, "Well, that's the truth. I mean, you just got to figure it." They go full Jerry Coyne. Let's put it this way: they go full Jerry Coyne on these people. But when it comes to, quote unquote indigenous people, which, like, I, as a non-anthropologist, I'm always a little confused as to what that means, because I mean, I'm obviously not indigenous to the United States, but I mean, am I an indigenous person because my ancestry was from Bengal for like a couple thousand years? Like these sorts of questions. But I guess the issue that I have there is, I mean, like, is there a limiting logic to this principle of local veto or local engagement?
Well, I think one way of looking at that is it's a good question that you ask, and the I think the scientific concern that is a valid scientific concern is, if I'm making decisions about the kinds of questions that I attempt to answer that are based on any restriction on what I'm willing to do research on, right? If I'm excluding things from my research horizon because because somebody tells me that the outcome of that research is not of interest to me and therefore you can't do it, or if the outcome of that research would be injurious to me, would hurt me, and therefore you can't do it, I can see that there's a scientific concern that I've introduced a bias into the kind of science that I'm doing. Right? I'm only going to work on the questions that have friendly outcomes, and outcomes that that are going to be unfriendly to various kinds of people, that will potentially, you could say, change their worldview, but what that means is that it changes the way that they interact with their relations, with their relatives, with their society, with their it changes, in some cases, their status in terms of arguments about land rights. Right? It's all kinds of things that can come out of genetic research. You say, I'm not going to work on those things. And I can see that there's a scientific concern that, and therefore, the science that I'm doing has this intrinsic bias that I'm not objective anymore. But I think that you have to get beyond that and say, well, wait a minute, why am I pulled toward, interested in studying the bones of people that I have no cultural or historic direct connection to, and so pulled toward it that I'm willing to not only not listen to the people who have a cultural historical connection, but I'm willing to fight them and overturn their will about whether I study them, right? I have to look at that and say, why am I this person, right? Why am I, as a scientist, if I were that scientist, right? I'm saying, what is it about me that makes me willing to do that? And I want to know the answer to that question. You could say, well, I'm objective. I study everyone. You don't study everybody. I know you don't study everybody. You're not studying your grandma. You're not digging up the graves in, rural New York, right? You're not. There are certain kinds of things that you're studying and not studying, and I want to reveal the entire decision making process about why you're studying it, because I think when you look at that entire decision making process, you've got bigger biases to worry about than the ones that
Yeah.
come from, right. You actually, right now, set that aside for a moment, just reboot and say, what should we do? Right? How should we move forward? I move forward by talking with the people that are potentially affected by the work that I do and understanding what their concerns are. And sometimes it's possible to find ways to work together with people that are really different, coming from a very different place than you are in your worldview. That's not, a unique situation in, working on other continents, working in colonial situations, working in, or historically colonial situations, working with indigenous peoples, right? We do the same thing when we work with communities in our neighborhood, right? We talk with people about what their concerns are, what their interests are. We talk with them about what kind of things we're able to do, and we are ethically required to be honest with them about the kinds of things that we can't do.
Yeah.
um, and so there is a responsibility that I take very seriously as someone who works on prehistoric remains. There's a responsibility to the heritage authorities in the nations where we work, because those are the arbiters of our ability to work there. I work, very closely with the South Africa Heritage Resource Agency, and that's, and when I work in other countries with their heritage agencies through permitting processes, et cetera. I take that very seriously, and in my responsibility to do the best possible thing, the scientifically the best practices sort of stuff with everything that I work with. Human remains, animal remains, the geological samples, right? Everything that we work with, we do best practices. And best practices today means working with possible descendant communities to understand their concerns, to communicate with them, to outreach with them, to provide them jobs where possible, in the work, to make sure that the kinds of positions that we have are open to people who are coming from those backgrounds. Um, and I think that that's a basic part of what science is today. It's easy to lose sight of that when you're working on hundreds of research papers with dozens of
Yeah.
postdoctoral associates, in a big laboratory like that. It's easy to lose sight of that. And I have great admiration for the big PIs that are running giant labs that really take that very seriously. It's hard to say the words correctly,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's
Well, so
important to listen to people.
yeah, I mean, you make a lot of good points, and I think, if people said it the way you said it would make so much more sense, right? But the way people say it is obviously much more condensed, and it's partly because, okay, if you're going to be interviewed on NPR, you got 5 minutes. Okay,
Oh yeah.
so I understand the constraints. One thing that I will say is, I've known you for a long time. I'm friends with you. I'm also friends with David Reich. One of the things that I mean, I don't know if I'm a Reich stan. I'm kind of a Reich stan, but in terms of, I feel like people use David Reich and his lab in particular as a scapegoat for broader systemic issues. So to give a concrete example, my friend Elish Mahi, she did a project in the Brazil, and it turns out that some of the indigenous Brazilians in the HGDP sample dataset collected back in the 1980s, and then popularized by Stanford and Cavalli Forza, etc. And I use these samples myself. They didn't know that their data had been out there to the whole world, and they were kind of shocked and outraged by it. And I understand it, but then people were using that. Um, to attack David Reich's lab and doing an analysis in 2015. And, I was just like, okay, guys, What about the Myers lab and what they did with the 650K SNP chip and 20, so people didn't know the whole history of this line and this data, and they wanted to kind of just jump on this. They wanted to punch up, and he is powerful. He does have like, this Templeton grant and all this stuff. And I think that all that is it's just it devolves into kind of middle school tribalism, and that really bothers me, and I have to say it. I've just seen that online multiple times, and, as someone who's worked with this data and who, like you, follows human population genetics very closely, there's like a whole history here that people are ignoring to kind of settle a beef. Am I wrong with that assessment?
I think if people knew the history of this, if some of the stories that I know of, um, from colleagues, that I'm not in a position to tell their stories, right? I've learned of stories over the years about sampling of populations in different parts of the world, of sampling of bone, of excavation situations, and there are, you know, I don't know what it would take to bring out the real dark places in the history of this field. Um, you know, I, but there are horrifying things that people have done in the name of human genetics,
Yeah.
and there are situations that maybe aren't horrifying in the sense that they began ethically, under the ethics of the time, um, and yet through inaction or neglect turned into horrifying situations in labs in various places. Samples that were retained and then resampled after tremendous lengths of time had passed, and there was no possibility that you could connect to any kind of human subjects protections that may have been pursued at one point. It's there are just um, there are so many bad things. I think you're absolutely correct in saying that it is unfair to have any one person today, you know, be blamed for all of the bad things that have happened, because no one could be to blame for all of them. There are too many. Um,
Yeah.
on the other hand, I do think, and this is nothing about David Reich. I totally agree. Right, David Reich should not be blamed for things that he didn't do. Um, I'm a big admirer of David. I think that he's done just tremendous work, and has led in many aspects of ethical interactions between researchers in ways that are not appreciated as widely as they should be. Um, so this is not a but. This is an and. And I would say that many people who are observers of the field really would like to see more scientists exercise visible ethical leadership. They would love to see scientists who are prominent saying things that indicate that they they observe restrictions on what they can do, and that they are promoting the people that they work with who are underrepresented, who are historically marginalized, who are I think just people want to see leadership. And and I'm not saying that any particular person doesn't hasn't shown leadership. My attitude is that you can never do enough. That certainly in our project we think of as many ways as possible to to exhibit, to show, to enable public voices of people who are early career, who are working on our projects, people who are working on them from many different perspectives. And it's incredibly challenging. This is today probably, in terms of project management in science, is probably the most challenging aspect of it, I find, and the one that occupies more of my thought processes, is how do we communicate to everyone the value of all of the contributions that we're getting, you know because it is so important today for everyone to understand that science is not just one lone scientist doing anything, right, not exploring the wilds for new dig sites, not toiling away in a laboratory, not having brilliant insights in a computer. We do all of this as big teams nowadays, and those big teams are made up of people who have very different career stages, reward situations, nationalities. They're living in different kinds, they work in different kinds of institutions, and we rely on those connections to have anything at the highest level today work. It is amazing that they do, and the more that we can do to build awareness of and the reality of those deep collaborations, interactions, and how important they are, the better we are, right? The better science is going to be.
All right, so I've been talking to you a while. I know that you probably have to go. So let me just ask you though. I wanna end on a high note. I alluded to the fact we've known each other for 15 years. We've seen a lot of great things. Some of them we didn't anticipate, and that was good because some of the best stuff in science. What are you thinking for the 2020s after COVID is over and all this stuff? You're back to South Africa. Like, what is your project? As you know, you're a tenured professor. You've been tenured for a while. You still got some good years left in you. Like, what do you want to write about? What do you want to explore? What are you anticipating?
You know, over we've got some amazing discoveries that are still going on in South Africa. We've got some cool stuff there. um, this year, next year, for a little while, I'm working on a project that involves, visualizing human genetics in different ways. I'm really getting into this. What I want is what I'm inspired by is Galileo. You know, in this particular way, right? Galileo uses a telescope. He's not the first to, I think, not the first to make a telescope, but he's first to use it for something interesting. and and it's that thing, that van Leeuwenhoek thing of, you have invented a new instrument and you can see things differently, and that enables you to do new science. And I think that we're ripe for that in human genetics, and genetics broadly, right? Because humans are just a subset of the same genetics as everybody else. um, I think that we're at a point where the PCA plots of these populations in the past, the kind of admixture graphs that we've been seeing, are are leaving too much information on the table. And I think that if we had better ways of visualizing that information, we would discover new things. So I'm working on a project that's related to visualization in that way. Um, I'm working on burial. I'm trying to understand death and mourning in these fossil hominins, because it has, been thrust upon me to understand why some aspects of what we consider to be human culture actually have these deeper roots, and what it means for them to have deeper roots, right? Does that mean that this aspect of humanity is is a deep thing that we've built everything else up on top of, or is this something that has sort of culturally come into being along with other kinds of human related skill sets? So, working on burial. But I got to be honest with you. If you asked me 5 years ago, what am I going to be working on now? I would not have answered it. I would have had a partial answer and not a complete answer. And
Yeah.
that's been true for every 5 year interval in my career. 10 year intervals, if you asked me 10 years ago what I'd be
Yeah.
working on now, I
Yeah.
would, it's just, there's no relationship. So
Well, I mean, do you think that's so I was talking to a friend of mine who just got tenure last year, and he's gonna do a major change in his he's at an R1 university not too far from you, very prestigious place, but he's gonna do a major change in his career where he's been really prominent, got a lot of publications before tenure, and now he's gonna do something totally different instead of extending his old work. Now, this is high risk, high reward. It might be thankless, but his theory is like, what's the point of tenure if you don't do something that's risky? And a lot of people in his department are just like, you're crazy. You should just like keep doing the stuff you're doing and continue to get those grants. Um, do you think that that's a problem in academia? Because like it seems like a lot of people would be 5 to 10 years later, they would be, well, I'm still exploring this molecular mechanism and publishing on it and getting all the details down. I mean, what do you think about that idea and thought?
I think it depends what drives your mind. I really do. I think, if you ask me, why are you not still, doing lots and lots of work on natural selection and human genetics, right? I can tell you the answer to that question. It's that this became an interesting enough scientific question that was worthy enough of NIH, grants and other kinds of things, that everybody who had the facility to it hired postdocs to do it. And postdocs can turn out the same kind of work a whole lot faster than I can.
Yeah.
and and so, what drives me is trying to think of what is the unexpected or unexplained thing that I can wedge my way into, and maybe enlighten, myself, and maybe some other people, by shedding better light on it. And that, if I were, running, a fleet of, if I were a dean, running a giant, number of people to do something, right? That's one thing. It's a management problem. And I have a few management problems, but what I try to do is to keep myself in a situation where I'm able to engage intellectually, with every project that I have going, whether it's a student project, or a project with collaborators. I don't want to be a part of it unless I'm actually contributing something intellectual to it. And and to do that kind of work, you have to keep your mind going. You have to keep your mind flexible. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, if what you love to do is to build, buildings, and having more concrete mixers is the way to do it, then, by all means, you should do that. But but in science, I think there's an important place for people who conceive of things that have a starting and an ending point, who carry it through, who put their own stamp on it, and maybe build something useful for other people, or maybe not. Right? Maybe it's just a beautiful thing that maybe nobody will cite it for 100 years, but we sort of hope that maybe somebody will pick up that strain, and find something useful in it sometime.
Yeah. Well, I've had you for a while. This is a really great conversation. I think the listeners will find this super interesting. I'm assuming most of them probably know of you, but maybe some of you don't. And if you don't know who John is, Google him, go to his blog, check out his Twitter, check out his publications, check out his books. Book with Lee Berger from a couple years ago, great. It's the whole wealth of interdisciplinary knowledge. It's kind of what I'm all about, and I think that's why John and I get along and we're friends. And John, after COVID's over, let's meet up at a conference and have a beer again because, I really miss those times.
Boy, it's time for those to come back. I'll tell you what, I owe so many right now that but I may be out of hope for this to go on because I won't be able to pay the beers. But, but but I don't mind that. This is a good investment.
All right, John. I will thank you for talking, and I will see you around.
Great, thank you.